I felt the thing that I might be most comfortable with was Jakey's speech out of As You Like It.
The 7 Ages of Man.
Yeah, so we can go.
There was one name that Pernell Roberts carried inside him for 45 long years. One face he could never quite forgive. One quiet anger that lived beneath every interview he gave and every role he accepted after walking away from the biggest show in America. He took that grudge with him all the way to a small home in Malibu, where he died at the age of 81. And the truth about who haunted him for nearly half a century is not the person you are expecting. The quiet goodbye nobody saw coming. On a cool Sunday morning in Malibu, on the 24th of January in the year 2010, a man took his final breath inside a small home that held no Hollywood awards on its walls. The 81-year-old actor, who had once stood beside Lorne Greene as Adam Cartwright slipped away from pancreatic cancer, and most of America barely noticed. You have to understand something about that morning, because it tells you everything about the man we are about to meet. The same television industry that had spent decades placing its biggest stars inside grand funeral processions sent almost nobody to honor Pernell Roberts. The few who came whispered the same question among themselves. Did he ever regret it? Did he ever forgive the man whose name still made his jaw tighten after all those years? His widow, a brilliant psychology professor named Eleanor Criswell, released a short statement through the family attorney Richard Stone. She said her husband had marched beside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery in the spring of 1965. She said he had pushed NBC to stop hiring white actors to play Black and Native American and Chinese roles on Bonanza. She said he had fought for the dignity of every person who was being mocked on primetime television, and that fight had never stopped, not even when it cost him everything. What she did not say, what nobody had the courage to say that morning, was the truth about why his funeral was so small. The Hollywood machine remembers the ones who play along. It forgets the ones who walk away. And Pernell Roberts had committed the unforgivable sin of being right too early, and of refusing ever again to share a room with the man he blamed for what Bonanza had become. The decision that ended his career and emptied his funeral was made 45 years earlier in a single moment inside a dressing room on a soundstage where the #1 show in America was being filmed. And the man who pushed him into that decision is someone Hollywood still does not want you to remember by name: the aristocrat sitting with the polka band. By the spring of that year, Bonanza was a phenomenon unlike anything television had ever seen. The show had climbed to #1 in the Nielsen ratings, which meant that on any given Sunday night, roughly 60 million Americans gathered around their living room sets to watch the Cartwright family ride across the Ponderosa. Chevrolet poured money into the show. RC. A Victor used it to sell colored television sets across the country. The 4 leading men were household names in every small town from Maine to California. Pernell Roberts was 36 years old and playing Adam Cartwright, the oldest and most educated of the 3 sons. He had a deep baritone voice that came from years of singing in summer stock theaters. He had trained as a Shakespearean actor. He had won the Drama Desk Award in 1955 for his performance in an off-Broadway production of Macbeth, which was the kind of honor that real actors dreamed about. And now, he was riding a horse around a fake ranch, calling a 50-year-old man Pa, and saying lines that made him cringe every single Monday morning when the scripts arrived. In an interview that year, he said something that would haunt his career forever. He told a reporter that being on Bonanza felt like being Isaac Stern sitting in with Lawrence Welk. Isaac Stern was one of the greatest classical violinists of the 20th century. Lawrence Welk was the man who hosted a polka show on Saturday nights. You can hear the contempt in that sentence even now. All these years later, he was not just unhappy. He was insulted by his own success. And I think this is where most people misunderstand Pernell Roberts. They think he left because he was arrogant. They think he had a swollen head and considered himself too good for television. But that is not what was happening at all. What was happening was something much deeper and much more painful. He told the Washington Post reporter Lawrence Laurent in May of 1963, 2 full years before he quit, the question that nobody at NBC wanted to answer. He asked, with genuine confusion in his voice, whether it was not a bit silly for 3 adult men to keep asking their father for permission to do anything. He was over 30 years old, playing a character who could not make a single decision without checking with the patriarch. He was a grown man saying yes, pa, and no, pa on cue, like a small boy at the dinner table. And he could not stop noticing how absurd it all was. He went to the producers. He went again and again to the one man who had created the show, the one man whose signature was on every script. That man's name was David Dortort, and every time Pernell asked for something better, David said no. The friction between them was real, it was constant, and it was personal. The producers ignored him. The network executives told him to be grateful and act. And quietly, beneath the surface, something cold began to grow between Pernell Roberts and the man who had built the Ponderosa. That is when Pernell started looking at the rest of the show, at the parts he had been trying to ignore for years, at the things he could no longer pretend not to see. The march from Selma to the soundstage. What he could no longer ignore was who was missing from the Ponderosa and who was being insulted in their absence. Every week, Bonanza brought guest stars to the ranch. White actors played Mexican bandits with painted-on mustaches and exaggerated accents. White actors played Native American chiefs in red face makeup, grunting through scripts that turned entire cultures into cartoon villains. Chinese characters existed only to be laughed at, only to bow and shuffle, only to mangle their English for the amusement of the audience. The actual Chinese-American actor, Victor Sen Yung, who played the family cook, Hop Sing, was paid a fraction of what the white stars earned and was given almost nothing to do beyond stereotype. Pernell Roberts looked at all of this and felt something he could not name. He was a southern boy from Waycross, Georgia, a small town where he had once taught Sunday school. He remembered standing in front of a small group of children one quiet morning, teaching them a lesson from the Bible about how every person on earth is equal in the eyes of God. He remembered believing that lesson with his whole heart. And now he was being paid a fortune to participate in a show that taught millions of children the exact opposite. So he did something that almost no Hollywood star of his level had ever done before. He started showing up at protests. In the late summer of 1963, when civil rights leaders called for the March on Washington, a quiet activist named James Garrett boarded a chartered plane from Los Angeles that was filled with celebrities flying east to stand with Dr. King. Burt Lancaster was on that plane. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward were on that plane. Marlon Brando and Rita Moreno were on that plane, and so was Pernell Roberts. Garrett later wrote about meeting Roberts on that flight. He described a tall, calm, serious man who told him he was from Waycross and who helped organize a press conference once they landed. There was no entourage, there was no publicity team, there were no cameras crowding around to capture the moment for a magazine spread. He just showed up because he believed he was supposed to. Around the same time, he walked a picket line in Torrance, California, with the Congress of Racial Equality. The cause was fair housing for black families who were being shut out of an all-white neighborhood. A photographer captured him holding a sign that read, "Fair housing for all." He marched alongside ordinary Americans who had no idea that the tall man beside them was one of the most recognizable faces on television. Then came the moment that mattered most. In March of 1965, John Lewis and hundreds of peaceful marchers were beaten by Alabama state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. The country watched in horror. Dr. King called for a third march, and this time it would go all the way from Selma to Montgomery. Pernell Roberts answered that call. A photographer named James Spider Martin, working for the Birmingham News, captured him at the City of St. Jude campsite in Montgomery, standing with the other marchers. The photograph still exists today, held safely inside the Alabama Department of Archives and History. He had walked beside Dr. King for miles, through danger and through history. His soon-to-be wife, Judith Lebrecht, walked beside him, and then he flew back to California. And he stepped back onto the Bonanza set, and he looked at the script for next week's episode. And the man whose office was just down the hall, the man whose name was on that script, suddenly represented everything Pernell could no longer stomach. The next confrontation between Pernell Roberts and David Dortort would not be quiet. It would be the loudest thing he has ever done. The contract he tore in half when Pernell Roberts walked into the production offices of Bonanza in the late spring of 1965. The executives already knew something was wrong. He had been complaining for years, of course. He had made his unhappiness known to anyone who would listen, and many people who refused to listen. He had even told a Miami newspaper that the whole experience had become such a mental crusher that he had gone to see a doctor for help. He was not exaggerating. He was carrying around 6 full years of frustration, and his body was starting to feel it. The other 3 stars had just signed a fresh contract for the upcoming season. Lorne Greene, Dan Blocker, and Michael Landon had each agreed to $10,000 per episode for the new round of shows. That worked out to a guaranteed minimum of $660,000 per actor for 33 episodes, plus full residuals from the first round of reruns. In today's money, we are talking about millions and millions of dollars. Walking away from that kind of guaranteed wealth was, by every Hollywood definition, completely insane. He walked away anyway. Lorne Greene, who had become something like an older brother figure to him on the set, sat him down for one final conversation. According to a story Greene later told a writer from People magazine, he leaned forward and tried to reach the part of Pernell that he believed must still be reasonable. He said something like this: "If you stay with Bonanza, you will make so much money that you will be able to build your own theater. You will be able to hire Tennessee Williams himself to write a play for you. You can have everything you ever dreamed about as an actor, and you can have it on your own terms, but only if you stay." It was the most generous version of the offer that Hollywood could possibly make. Stay rich. Stay famous. Buy your principles later. And Roberts looked at this older man whom he respected, and he shook his head. He could not buy his principles later. They were not for sale at any price. David Dortort was the one man Pernell could not look in the eye anymore. The creator of Bonanza had heard every complaint and answered almost none of them. He had received every memo about the racist scripts and the childish dialogue and the cartoon villains, and he had filed those memos away in a drawer. Pernell had asked him for grown-up storylines. Pernell had asked him to let Adam marry, to let Adam leave the ranch, to let Adam become a man. David had refused all of it. To Pernell, the answer behind every refusal was the same. The show was making too much money to risk changing anything, and the man who had built it would not let one stubborn actor rock the boat. When Pernell finally walked out, he did not slam any doors, and he did not give a farewell speech. He simply did not come back. The writers at the studio reacted the way writers always react when a star vanishes. They wrote Adam Cartwright off the ranch by saying he had moved away to sea, then later that he had sailed all the way to Australia. They handled his absence the way you handle a small embarrassment, by pretending it had never been a big deal. But the real punishment was not in the script. The real punishment was waiting for him in the years to come, and Hollywood had a long memory. The wound that opened that spring would never close. Pernell would not speak David Dortort's name with warmth ever again, and David, in the privacy of his own old age, would carry his own version of that same wound for the rest of his life. The two men would not properly reconcile before death took them both. The years Hollywood tried to erase. The next 14 years of Pernell Roberts' career are usually described as a blacklist. He was not officially blacklisted in the way that screenwriters were blacklisted during the McCarthy era. There was no list with his name on it. There was no NBC memo banning him from television. What there was, instead, was something almost worse, because it had no name and no rules, and no end date. Hollywood simply decided that he was difficult. And once that word attaches to your name in that town, doors close very quietly, and you never quite hear them shut. He himself described it best in an interview years later. He said that for a long time after he left Bonanza, he was considered too independent. He said that meant he ended up getting the rejects that other actors could afford to turn down. He never named the man he believed had whispered that word about him through every executive office in town, but everyone in the family knew who he blamed. The whispers had a source, and the source had an office on the Bonanza lot. Here is the part of the story that almost nobody tells, and I think this is where you start to understand the kind of man he really was. He did not sit around feeling sorry for himself. He did not give angry interviews about how Hollywood had wronged him. He did not write a bitter memoir. He just went back to the thing he had always loved most, which was the stage. He toured the country in Camelot, playing King Arthur in Kansas City and Pittsburgh. He played Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music. He played the Music Man. He played Petruchio in Kiss Me, Katit. He went to Broadway in 1967 for a musical called Mata Hari. He starred opposite the legendary Ingrid Bergman in Captain Brassbound's Conversion in 1972. He played Rhett Butler in a musical version of Gone with the Wind in 1973. And he picked up a Joseph Jefferson Award nomination at the Ivanhoe Theater in Chicago that same year. He also took every television guest role that came his way because he refused to be too proud to work. He appeared in more than 60 different shows during those so-called blacklist years. He was on Mission Impossible. He was on The Wild Wild West. He was on Mannix. He was on Marcus Welby, Emmed. He was on Hawaii Five-0. He was on Gunsmoke. He was on The Odd Couple. He was on Ironside. He was on The Big Valley. The man was working constantly, just never at the level he had once known. His son, Jonathan Christopher Roberts, who had been born in 1951, was killed in a motorcycle accident on the 29th of April in 1989. He was 37 years old. Pernell was 60. I have thought a lot about what that loss must have felt like for him after everything else he had given up. He had walked away from millions of dollars in 1965. He had walked away from fame. He had walked away from the easy life. And now, the one piece of his life that had nothing to do with Hollywood, the son he had raised, was suddenly gone too. If anyone had earned the right to become bitter, it was him. But somehow, even then, he never did. Because, by that point, something extraordinary had already happened. Hollywood, in its strange and reluctant way, had given him one last chance, and he had taken it. The comeback and the eulogy nobody talks about. In the late summer of 1979, after a decade and a half of theater tours and small television parts, Pernell Roberts received a phone call that changed everything one more time. CBS was developing a new medical drama. It was called Trapper John M.D., and it was a continuation of the character Hawkeye Pierce had served alongside in the Korean War of the original MASH novel and movie. The producers needed someone who could play a brilliant, witty, slightly arrogant surgeon at San Francisco Memorial Hospital. They had two other actors in mind. Wayne Rogers was one. John Forsythe was the other. Both were established stars with no Bonanza baggage attached. But Pernell Roberts read for the part, and when he walked out of the room, the producers knew they had found their man. The show premiered on the 23rd of September in 1979. It ran for 7 straight seasons. He earned an Emmy nomination in 1981. He had become a star all over again, this time on his own terms, in a role written for an adult, on a network that was not NBC. The vindication must have tasted incredible. The fact that this comeback happened on CBS, a full network away from the people who had run Bonanza, was not a small detail to Pernell. It was a quiet revenge that lasted 7 years. But the moment from this chapter that has stayed with me the longest has nothing to do with the show. It happened in November of 1980, in the middle of his triumphant return, and almost nobody talks about it. Victor Sen-Yung, the Chinese-American actor who had played Hop Sing on Bonanza for 14 years, died alone in his small North Hollywood home from accidental natural gas poisoning. A leaking oven had filled the house with fumes. He was 65 years old, and his body was not discovered until the 9th of November. The Wisconsin State Journal reported the story the next day. He had been struggling financially. He had been largely forgotten by the industry that had once paid him to bow and shuffle and provide comic relief. When the funeral was arranged, almost nobody from Bonanza came forward to help. Almost nobody asked who would pay for the service. Almost nobody from the production team that had grown rich off that show volunteered to speak about the man who had stood beside the Cartwrights for so many years. But one person did. Pernell Roberts paid for the entire funeral out of his own pocket. And then he stood up at the service and delivered the eulogy for Victor Sen-Yung himself. Think about that for a moment, because this is the kind of small, quiet act that tells you who a person really is when nobody is watching. Adam Cartwright stood up and buried Hop Sing, the man who had spent 6 years arguing with David Dortort about how minorities were treated on the show, personally honored the actor whom the show had used and discarded. He did it without a press release. He did it without a magazine profile. He did it because it was the right thing to do, and because nobody else was going to do it. I genuinely believe this single moment tells you more about Pernell Roberts than any contract he ever signed or any interview he ever gave. He had not walked away from Bonanza because he hated the show. He had walked away because he loved the people the show was failing. And 15 years later, when one of those people died alone and broke, he made sure that man's last journey was paid for in full. That is not a story Hollywood likes to tell because it makes the rest of Hollywood look small in comparison. But it is the truth, and it is documented, and you deserve to know it. The last one. He had a way of signing letters in the final years of his life. He would write his name as Pernell, the last one, Roberts. It was a small joke at first, because his father had been Pernell Sr. and he was Pernell Jr., but over time, the phrase took on a heavier meaning. He really was the last one. By the time he died in 2010, Dan Blocker had been gone for 38 years, taken by a sudden pulmonary embolism after gallbladder surgery on the 13th of May in 1972, just 43 years old. Lorne Greene had been gone for 23 years, taken by respiratory complications on the 11th of September in 1987, following ulcer surgery. Michael Landon had been gone for 19 years, taken by the same pancreatic cancer that would eventually take Pernell himself on the 1st of July in 1991. And then there was David Dortort, the man Pernell Roberts had never forgiven, the creator of Bonanza, the one whose office had been the source of every script he hated, every decision he opposed, every quiet roadblock to the kind of character Pernell had wanted Adam Cartwright to become. David Dortort outlived Pernell by exactly 8 months. He died in September of 2010, 93 years old, full of his own quiet regrets. Late in his life, David sat down for a long oral history with the Television Academy Foundation. He spoke for hours about every actor and every storyline. When the interviewer reached the subject of Pernell Roberts, David's tone softened in a way that surprised everyone in the room. He admitted that he had been too hard on Pernell. He admitted that he had not appreciated him at the time. He said that he knew Roberts was good, but he had never realized just how good. "None better," he said quietly, "none better." That confession came 40 years too late. Pernell never heard it from his lips. The two men never sat across from one another in a quiet room and made their peace. The grudge that had started over a single script in a single dressing room in 1965 lasted until both of them were in the ground. That is the confession at the heart of this story. The man Pernell Roberts hated and never forgave was the man who had built the Ponderosa and then refused to let Adam Cartwright grow up inside it. Pernell married 4 times across his long life. His first wife, Vera Mowry, became a respected professor of theater history at Hunter College. with a named chair eventually established in her honor. His second wife, Judith Lebrecht, had walked beside him at Selma. His third marriage to Kara Nack ended in 1996. And then, in 1997, he married the woman who would carry him through the final chapter of his life. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Criswell, a brilliant humanistic psychologist who had taught at Sonoma State University for decades and who edited a journal devoted to the connection between body and mind. She survived him by 14 years until her own death in September of 2024. She never sold his story. She never wrote a tell-all book. She never appeared on television to share his secrets. She just protected the quiet dignity of the man she had loved, the same way he had protected his own dignity all those years before. Here is the truth about Pernell Roberts that I think we forget too easily in a world that rewards loudness. He never recanted. He never apologized for leaving. He never came back on a talk show to tell America that he had been wrong about Bonanza, or that David had been right all along. In an interview late in life, he was asked once again about his decision, and he reportedly said that he had not enjoyed Bonanza, but that he had never said all the harsh things people had quoted him saying over the years. Even in his old age, he was protecting the truth from being twisted into something simpler. He was a man who chose the harder road in 1965 and walked it for 45 years without ever once turning back. He marched at Selma when most actors would not even march into a producer's office. He paid for a forgotten friend's funeral when nobody else would. He took the smaller jobs when the bigger ones would have required him to be a smaller person. And when he died on that quiet Sunday in Malibu, the world did not give him a parade because the world had never quite figured out what to do with a man who refused to be bought and who refused to forgive the one man he believed had stolen the show he could have loved. Pernell, the last one, Roberts. That was how he signed his name. And in the end, that was exactly what he was. That is the final confession behind the man Pernell Roberts never forgave. Please share your thoughts on it in the comments below. Do you believe he was right to carry that grudge to his grave? Or do you think he should have made peace with David Dortort before the end?